Sometimes the people who love us most leave us when we need them the greatest. When 8-year-old Nita lost her grandfather last winter, she thought he'd left her with nothing but heartache and an old dog named Scout. But in the desert of New Mexico, where her grandfather's crumbling cabin sits on what everyone calls worthless land, Scout starts digging in places that make grown men nervous. What the dog uncovers beneath those weathered floorboards is a secret worth $200 million, a discovery that powerful people have been hunting for over a century. Now this little Apache girl must protect what's rightfully hers. But she has no idea how dangerous that fight is about to become. Will Nita and Scout be strong enough to face the enemies closing in on their doorstep? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun stretched long fingers across the New Mexico desert, painting the adobe walls of the small cabin in shades of amber and rust. Nita pressed her face against the single window, watching dust devils dance in the distance like spirits welcoming the day. At 8 years old, she had learned to find beauty in this harsh landscape that most people called empty and worthless. Her grandfather's hand-carved wooden eagle feather lay on the windowsill, its intricate details catching the early light. It was the only thing of his she kept close, worn smooth by decades of handling. He had carved it during his time in the war, he'd told her, when homesickness felt like a physical ache in his chest. Now it was hers, a bridge to memories that grew more precious with each passing day. Scout padded across the wooden floor, his nails clicking against the weathered boards. The old dog's coat had turned silver around his muzzle, but his dark eyes remained sharp and knowing. He had been her grandfather's companion for 12 years before becoming hers, and sometimes Nita wondered if Scout understood more about their situation than she did. "Good morning, old friend," she whispered, running, her fingers through his thick fur. Scout leaned into her touch, then moved to the door with the patient expectation that had become their morning routine. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly in every direction. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away, and the town of Cedar Ridge was a dusty 40-minute walk along the dirt road that barely deserved the name. Most days, Nita preferred the solitude. The desert spoke to her in ways that people rarely did. Her grandfather had built this cabin with his own hands after returning from World War II, choosing this remote spot deliberately. Sometimes a man needs distance from the world to remember who he is, he used to say. The structure was simple but sturdy, thick adobe walls that stayed cool in summer and held warmth in winter, a red tile roof that sang with the sound of rare desert rains, and a stone chimney that drew smoke straight up into the vast sky. Inside, every object told a story. The kitchen table bore knife marks from decades of meal preparation. The bookshelf held volumes on Apache history, desert survival, and astronomy, her grandfather's 3 great passions. A faded photograph on the mantel showed him in his army uniform, young and serious, standing with other Navajo code talkers whose courage had helped win the war. Nita had memorized every inch of this place during the 6 months since his passing. The loose board near the stove that creaked when stepped on. The way the wind made the roof tiles settle with tiny clicking sounds on cold nights. The patch of morning sunlight that moved across the floor like a golden clock, marking the passage of time. Her daily routine had become a careful dance of survival. Each morning, she checked the water barrel her grandfather had positioned to catch rainwater from the roof. She tended the small vegetable garden behind the cabin, coaxing life from the stubborn desert soil with methods he had taught her. She gathered eggs from the 3 chickens who had somehow thrived in this harsh environment, their coop built against the cabin's north wall for protection from the wind. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge viewed her situation with a mixture of pity and suspicion. When she walked the dusty main street to trade vegetables for supplies, she heard their whispered conversations. "Poor little thing, all alone out there. That land's not fit for farming. Child services should step in." The old man filled her head with nonsense about Apache ways. But Nita had learned to tune out their voices. Her grandfather had taught her that other people's opinions were like tumbleweeds. They might blow around and make noise, but they had no roots and no lasting power. What mattered was the wisdom passed down through generations of her people, the knowledge that ran deeper than the shallow concerns of town gossip. At the general store, Mr. Henderson treated her with grudging fairness, accepting her vegetables. In trade for flour, salt, and other necessities. His wife, however, made no secret of her disapproval. "A child shouldn't be living alone like that," she would mutter. "It's not natural." Mrs. Henderson didn't understand that Nita was never truly alone. Scout was always by her side, and beyond that, she felt the presence of her ancestors in every sunrise, every whispered wind, every star-filled night. Her grandfather had taught her to listen to these deeper voices, to find guidance in the natural world that surrounded their small cabin. The land itself seemed worthless to outsiders. Rocky, arid, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional hardy juniper tree. No obvious water source except for the seasonal creek that ran full only during the brief monsoon season. No mineral deposits that anyone had bothered to survey. No development potential that would interest investors or builders. But Scout saw something different in this landscape. Over the past few weeks, Nita had noticed the old dog's behavior changing in subtle ways. He would spend long minutes staring at certain spots around the cabin, his head tilted as if listening to sounds only he could hear. Sometimes he would begin digging, then stop abruptly and look toward the cabin with an expression that seemed almost guilty. "What is it, Scout?" she would ask, but the dog would only wag his tail and trot away, leaving small holes that served no apparent purpose. Her grandfather had always said that animals possessed wisdom that humans had forgotten. "They remember the old ways," he would tell her during their evening talks by the fireplace. "They know things we've trained ourselves not to see." On quiet evenings, when the desert air carried the scent of sage and the distant call of coyotes, Nita would sit on the cabin's small porch and remember those conversations. Her grandfather had filled her mind with stories, some from Apache tradition, others from his time in the war, and still others that seemed to blend history with mystery in ways that made her wonder where truth ended and legend began. He had spoken of Spanish explorers who had traveled through this region centuries ago, of lost treasures and forgotten maps, of injustices that echoed through generations. At the time, Nita had listened with the fascination of a child hearing fairy tales. Now, alone except for Scout's companionship, she found herself wondering if those stories had contained more truth than fiction. The desert had a way of keeping secrets. Its vastness could swallow evidence of human passage, hiding stories beneath layers of sand and time. Her grandfather had understood this landscape in ways that went beyond simple survival. He had read its moods, respected its power, and learned to find sustenance in its seeming emptiness. As the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in deeper blues, Nita began her daily tasks. But she found herself watching Scout more carefully, noting the places where his attention lingered. The old dog's behavior was becoming impossible to ignore, and something in his persistent interest made her grandfather's mysterious stories feel less like legends and more like memories waiting to be uncovered. The wooden eagle feather caught her eye again as she passed the window. Her grandfather had carved each delicate ridge and curve with infinite patience, creating something beautiful from simple materials. Sometimes, he had told her, the most valuable things are hidden in plain sight. Looking out at the seemingly worthless land that was now her inheritance, Nita began to wonder if Scout was trying to show her something that had been hidden in plain sight all along. 3 weeks later, Scout's mysterious behavior reached a breaking point. The old dog had begun focusing his attention on the eastern wall of the cabin where the morning sun first touched the adobe. He would sit there for hours, occasionally, whining softly or scratching at the hard-packed earth with his front paws. Nita had tried to redirect his attention, offering him treats and calling him for walks, but Scout remained fixated on that particular spot. His persistence reminded her of the way her grandfather used to concentrate on his wood carving, returning to the same piece day after day until it revealed its hidden beauty. On a particularly warm afternoon, when the desert air shimmered with heat and even the lizards sought shade, Scout began digging with unusual intensity. His powerful shoulders bunched as he worked, sending dirt flying in small clouds. Nita watched from the porch, initially frustrated by what seemed like pointless destruction of the area around their home. "Scout, stop that!" she called, but the dog ignored her completely, something he had never done before. The digging continued for nearly an hour. Scout's coat became dusty, his pink tongue lolling as he panted from exertion, but his determination never wavered. Finally, he stepped back and barked once, a sharp, triumphant sound that made Nita look more carefully at what he had uncovered. Something metallic glinted in the disturbed earth. Nita approached cautiously, kneeling beside the small crater Scout had created. There, partially buried in the desert soil, lay a coin unlike anything she had ever seen. It was larger than a modern quarter, dark with age, and covered in designs that looked foreign and ancient. She brushed away the remaining dirt with trembling fingers, revealing intricate Spanish text and symbols that meant nothing to her but somehow felt significant. The coin was heavy for its size, and when she held it up to catch the light, it gleamed with the dull shine of old silver. Scout sat beside her, panting with satisfaction, as if he had been working toward this moment for weeks. His dark eyes watched her examine the coin, and she could swear he looked pleased with himself. "Where did this come from, boy?" she whispered. The discovery sent her mind racing back to her grandfather's stories about Spanish explorers and lost treasures. Those tales had always seemed like entertainment, ways to pass long winter evenings by the fire. But here was physical evidence, a genuine Spanish coin buried near their cabin. That evening, she spread her grandfather's books across the kitchen table, searching for anything that might help her understand what Scout had found. The volumes on Southwest history contained references to Spanish expeditions, mentions of silver mines, and trade routes that had crisscrossed this region centuries ago. In one particularly worn book, she found a chapter about Spanish colonial coins. The text was dense and academic, but the photographs showed coins similar to the one now sitting on her table. According to the book, such coins were often buried for safekeeping during times of conflict or upheaval. The implications made her stomach flutter with nervous excitement. If there was one coin, there might be others. If Scout had found it so easily, what else might be hidden around their property? But excitement quickly gave way to unease. The next morning, while walking into town for supplies, Nita noticed things that hadn't registered before. An unfamiliar pickup truck parked near the general store. Two men in city clothes asking Mr. Henderson questions about the old Apache's place. Their conversation stopped abruptly when they noticed her approaching. "You're the girl living out at Joe Crowwing's old cabin," one of them said. He had pale skin and eyes that seemed to calculate her worth in a single glance. Nita nodded cautiously, clutching her basket of vegetables. "We're interested in buying that land," the man continued. "It's not suitable for a child living alone. We could offer you enough money to start fresh somewhere else." "It's not for sale," Nita replied quietly. The men exchanged glances. "Think about it," the second man said. "That's harsh country out there. No place for a little girl." As they walked away, Nita heard fragments of their conversation carried on the desert wind. Words like survey and mineral rights and old claims that made no immediate sense but filled her with growing worry. Mr. Henderson noticed her troubled expression. "Those fellows have been asking questions for days," he said quietly, "wanting to know about your grandfather, about the land, about whether you have any family coming to help you. What did you tell them?" "Nothing that wasn't already public knowledge," he assured her. "But you be careful, child. When strangers start asking questions about property, it usually means they know something the owner doesn't." That night, Nita lay awake, listening to Scout's restless movement around the cabin. The old dog seemed agitated, moving from window to window, as if watching for something in the darkness. His behavior reminded her of the way he had acted during thunderstorms when her grandfather was alive. Protective and alert to danger she couldn't perceive. She began to notice other unsettling details. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt road that led past their property. The sense of being watched when she worked in the garden. Scout's increasingly frequent trips to the eastern wall of the cabin, where he would sniff the ground and whine softly. 3 days after finding the coin, Scout's agitation reached a fever pitch. He spent the entire morning pacing around the cabin, occasionally stopping to scratch at the floorboards inside the house. His behavior was so unusual that Nita began to worry he might be ill. "What's wrong, boy?" she asked, kneeling beside him as he pawed at a section of floor near the kitchen table. Scout looked up at her, then back at the floorboards, then up again. His message was clear. There was something beneath the floor that demanded attention. Nita examined the boards more carefully. Most of them were fitted tightly together, worn smooth by decades of foot traffic. But in the area where Scout kept returning, she noticed that several boards seemed slightly raised, as if the nails holding them had loosened over time. Using a kitchen knife as a makeshift pry bar, she managed to lift one of the loose boards. The space beneath was dark and musty, filled with the scent of old wood and desert earth. But it was clearly hollow. Not just the usual gap between floorboards and ground, but a deliberately created space. Scout immediately stuck his nose into the opening, his tail wagging with excitement. When he pulled back, he barked once and looked at her expectantly. Nita's heart pounded as she realized what Scout had been trying to tell her. The coin hadn't been a random discovery, it was a clue. Her grandfather's cabin had been built over something hidden, something valuable enough that strangers were now asking questions about their worthless land. As she stared into the dark opening, beneath the floorboards, Nita understood that her quiet life of survival and solitude was about to change dramatically. Whatever her grandfather had hidden beneath their home was about to transform her from an orphaned girl on worthless land into the guardian of secrets that powerful people would kill to possess. Scout's persistent digging hadn't been random behavior. It had been a mission, and now that mission was hers. The hidden space beneath the floorboards revealed itself slowly, like a secret garden emerging from winter's grip. By the light of her grandfather's old kerosene lantern, Nita discovered that the cavity extended much further than she had imagined. What had appeared to be a simple hollow was actually a carefully constructed cellar, lined with stones and fitted with wooden shelves. Scout descended into the space first, his movements confident and sure, as if he had known about this hiding place all along. Nita followed cautiously, her feet finding handholds that seemed deliberately placed in the stone walls. The air below was cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of cedar and something else, old leather and aged paper. The cellar was larger than the cabin's kitchen above, carved from the desert hardpan with the same patient skill her grandfather had shown in all his work. Along the walls, wooden shelves held an assortment of containers, some made of metal, others wrapped in oiled cloth, all designed to protect their contents from moisture and time. Nita's hands trembled as she opened the first container, a sturdy metal box that reminded her of the ones her grandfather had used to store his carving tools. Inside, nestled in soft fabric, lay a collection of documents unlike anything she had ever seen. The papers were thick and yellowed, covered in flowing Spanish script and decorated with elaborate seals and ribbons. She couldn't read the words, but the official appearance of the documents suggested their importance. Maps drawn on parchment showed rivers and mountains she didn't recognize, marked with symbols that seemed to indicate locations of special significance. At The bottom of the box, wrapped in its own protective cloth, was a leather-bound journal filled with her grandfather's familiar handwriting. The pages contained detailed notes about the documents, translations of key passages, and sketches of the symbols found on the maps. As she turned the pages carefully, Nita began to understand that her grandfather had spent years studying these papers, trying to unlock their secrets. Scout had positioned himself near the cellar entrance, his ears pricked and alert. His protective stance reminded Nita that the world above remained dangerous, filled with strangers who were asking questions about her property. Whatever these documents represented, they were valuable enough to attract unwanted attention. She was still examining the journal when she heard the sound of a vehicle approaching on the dirt road. Scout's low growl confirmed her fear. This was not a friendly visit. Quickly, she closed the metal box and climbed back into the cabin, replacing the loose floorboards just as someone knocked firmly on the front door. Through the window, she could see an old woman standing beside a dusty sedan. The visitor was Native American, her silver hair braided in the traditional style, her posture straight despite her obvious age. Something about the woman's bearing suggested strength and authority, qualities that reminded Nita strongly of her grandfather. "Child, I know you're in there," the woman called. "My name is Ruby Songbird. I was your grandfather's sister." Nita's heart stopped. Her grandfather had never mentioned having a sister. In all their conversations about family and Apache traditions, he had spoken of cousins and ancestors, but never a living sibling. Cautiously, she opened the door. The woman's face was weathered like desert stone, marked by years of sun and hardship, but her dark eyes held the same gentle wisdom that Nita remembered in her grandfather's gaze. "You look just like your mother did at your age," Ruby said softly. "May I come in?" Scout, who had been tense with protective energy, suddenly relaxed. His tail began to wag as he approached Ruby, sniffing her outstretched hand with obvious recognition. "Hello, old friend," Ruby murmured to the dog. "You've been taking good care of her, haven't you?" Inside the cabin, Ruby's eyes took in every detail with the practiced assessment of someone who understood the significance of what she was seeing. Her gaze lingered on the wooden eagle feather, the faded photograph of her grandfather in uniform, and the books scattered across the kitchen table. "I heard Joe had passed," she said, settling into the chair her grandfather had always favored. "I came as soon as I could arrange to leave my work." "Grandfather never told me about you," Nita said carefully. Ruby's expression grew sad. "Your grandfather and I had a disagreement many years ago, a serious one, about family business that seemed too dangerous to resolve. I've regretted our separation every day since." "What kind of disagreement?" Ruby studied her for a long moment, as if deciding how much truth an 8-year-old could handle. "Your grandfather found something during the war. Documents that proved our family's land had been stolen through fraud and forgery. He wanted to fight for justice through the courts. I thought it was too dangerous, that powerful people would hurt our family to protect their secrets." Nita's mind raced. The documents hidden beneath the floor suddenly took on new meaning. "I was wrong," Ruby continued. "I let fear convince me to abandon the fight for what was rightfully ours. I left this place and spent my life working for other people's causes, trying to make up for the courage I didn't show when my own family needed it. How did you know to come now? Because men in expensive suits have been asking questions about this property in 3 different towns. Word travels. Fast in Indian country when outsiders start sniffing around." Ruby's revelation confirmed Nita's worst fears. The strangers weren't casual land speculators. They were searching for something specific, something connected to the documents her grandfather had hidden. "Child," Ruby said gently, "I need to know what your grandfather left behind. Not just the land, but anything else. Papers, maps, artifacts, anything that might explain why these people are suddenly so interested in what everyone else considers worthless desert." Nita hesitated. She had learned to be cautious about trusting adults, even those who claimed to be family. But something in Ruby's bearing, combined with Scout's obvious acceptance of the woman, convinced her to take a risk. "There's something I need to show you," she said finally. Ruby's eyes widened as Nita lifted the loose floorboards, revealing the hidden cellar. The older woman's sharp intake of breath suggested that she had suspected such a hiding place might exist, but had never been certain. "He actually did it," Ruby whispered. "He found a way to preserve the evidence." In the cellar, surrounded by her grandfather's carefully preserved secrets, Ruby examined the documents with the expertise of someone who had spent decades fighting legal battles over tribal rights. Her translations of the Spanish text revealed a story that made Nita's blood run cold. The papers were land grants and mining claims dating back to the 1800s, documents that proved vast areas of what was now considered public land had originally been granted to Apache families. But the grants had been stolen through a complex web of fraud, forgery, and violence that had enriched a handful of families while impoverishing entire communities. "This represents millions of dollars in current value," Ruby explained. "Not just the land itself, but mineral rights, water rights, and legal claims for damages that compound over time. Your grandfather spent his life documenting how these crimes were committed and who benefited from them." As Ruby continued examining the documents, her expression grew increasingly troubled. "Child," she said finally, "we're not just dealing with historical injustice. Some of the families named in these papers are still wealthy and powerful today. They've built their fortunes on stolen land, and they'll do anything to prevent the truth from coming to light." Nita understood now why her grandfather had seemed so protective of their remote property, why he had taught her to be self-sufficient and wary of strangers. He hadn't just been raising her to survive in the desert, he had been preparing her to guard secrets that could destroy some of the most powerful people in the Southwest. Scout's sudden alertness drew their attention back to the world above. Through the cellar entrance, they could hear the sound of multiple vehicles approaching on the desert road. Ruby moved with the swift efficiency of someone who had faced danger before. She quickly replaced the documents in their protective containers, while Nita secured the cellar and repositioned the floorboards. Above them, the sound of car doors slamming indicated that their visitors had arrived with serious intentions. "Let me handle this," Ruby said firmly. "You stay close to Scout and don't volunteer any information." Through the window, they could see 3 men approaching the cabin. 2 were the same strangers who had approached Nita in town, but the third was older, better dressed, and carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. The knock on the door was sharp and impatient. "Miss Crowing?" the older man called. "My name is Vincent Blackwood. I represent a development consortium interested in this property. I believe we can reach a mutually beneficial arrangement." Ruby opened the door with the calm dignity that Nita was beginning to recognize as a family trait. "I'm Ruby Songbird, Nita's grandmother," she said evenly. "The child is under my protection now." Blackwood's eyes narrowed slightly. "I see. Well, perhaps that makes our conversation easier. Surely you understand that this isolated location is no place for a young girl. Our offer would provide her with resources for education and a better future. What kind of development are you planning?" Ruby asked. "Nothing too ambitious," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Some mineral exploration, perhaps a small tourist facility to take advantage of the desert scenery. The usual rural economic development." Scout had positioned himself between the visitors and Nita, his hackles slightly raised, the dog's instinctive distrust of Blackwood was so obvious that even the man himself seemed to notice it. "Interesting animal," Blackwood observed. "He seems quite protective. I hope he's not aggressive with strangers." "Only with those who pose a threat," Ruby replied calmly. Blackwood smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Songbird, I'm sure you're aware that maintaining a property this remote requires significant resources. Property taxes, maintenance, basic utilities. These costs can quickly overwhelm a fixed income. We're managing fine, for now perhaps. But what about next year or the year after? Children have needs that increase as they grow. Educational expenses, medical care, preparation for college and career. Nita could hear the subtle threat beneath Blackwood's reasonable tone. He was suggesting that their current situation was unsustainable, that financial pressure would eventually force them to sell whether they wanted to or not. "Mr. Blackwood," Ruby said, "I appreciate your concern for my granddaughter's welfare, but this land has been in our family for generations. It's not for sale at any price." One of Blackwood's companions stepped forward slightly, and Nita noticed the way his jacket bulged in a manner that suggested concealed weapons. The implied threat was subtle but unmistakable. "That's unfortunate," Blackwood said. "Sometimes sentimental. Attachment to worthless property prevents people from making rational decisions. I hope you'll reconsider before circumstances force a less favorable arrangement." After the men left, Ruby sat heavily in her grandfather's chair, looking suddenly older and more tired. "Who is Vincent Blackwood?" Nita asked. "A very dangerous man," Ruby replied. "His family has been stealing Apache land for over a century. His great-grandfather was a territorial judge who specialized in finding legal ways to transfer tribal property to white settlers and mining companies." Ruby reached into her travel bag and withdrew a worn military medal in a small display case. Nita recognized it immediately. Her grandfather had shown her the same decoration many times, explaining how he had earned it serving as a Navajo code talker in the Pacific Theater. "Your grandfather never told you the whole story about his war." "Service," Ruby said. "He wasn't just a radio operator. Because he could speak Spanish fluently in addition to Navajo and English, he was sometimes assigned to intelligence work, recovering documents from captured positions, translating enemy communications." She opened the display case, revealing that the medal was mounted on a backing that contained a hidden compartment. Inside were several small photographs and what appeared to be additional documents. During the occupation of New Mexico by Confederate forces, many Spanish colonial documents were hidden or stolen. Your grandfather discovered some of these papers in a captured Confederate supply depot. When he realized they proved the theft of Apache lands, he kept them safe, planning to use them for justice after the war. The photographs showed her grandfather as a young soldier, but also included images of documents and locations that Nita didn't recognize. One photo showed a group of men in suits standing beside surveyors' equipment, their faces serious as they posed in what looked like desert terrain. "The Blackwood family has known about these documents for decades," Ruby continued. "They've been searching for them, buying up property throughout the region, hoping to find where your grandfather hid the evidence of their crimes." Nita studied the photographs more carefully. In one image, she could clearly see a younger version of Vincent Blackwood, standing with other men beside what appeared to be mining equipment. "They're not just land developers," she realized. "No, a child. They're thieves trying to cover up a century of theft. The documents your grandfather preserved prove that the Blackwood family built their fortune by forging land titles, bribing officials, and sometimes using violence to drive Apache families from valuable property." Ruby's explanation made Nita's stomach twist with anger and fear. Her family's poverty, her grandfather's isolated life, her current vulnerability, all of it was connected to crimes committed by people who had never faced consequences for their actions. "What do we do now?" "We fight," Ruby said firmly, "but we fight smart. Your grandfather spent 30 years preparing for this battle. He documented everything, created legal evidence that can't be disputed, and trained Scout to help protect the most important secrets." As if summoned by his name, Scout approached Ruby and sat at her feet. The old woman reached into her bag again and produced a leather pouch that smelled of sage and other traditional herbs. "Your grandfather asked me to give this to you if anything ever happened to him," she said, handing Nita the pouch. "He said you would understand its significance when the time came." Inside the pouch was a small metal key and a piece of paper with coordinates written in her grandfather's careful handwriting. The key was old and ornate, unlike anything she had seen before. "What does it open?" Nita asked. Ruby smiled for the first time since arriving. "Your grandfather's final surprise. The documents in the cellar are just the beginning, child. He hid the most important evidence somewhere even more secure, somewhere the Blackwood family will never think to look." Scout's sudden bark drew their attention to the window. In the distance, a cloud of dust indicated another vehicle approaching on the desert road. "More visitors?" Nita asked nervously. Ruby peered through the window, then relaxed visibly. "No, child, this time it's help. I called some friends before coming here, people who have been waiting 30 years for the chance to see justice done." The approaching vehicle turned out to be a weathered pickup truck, driven by a man whose gray braids and traditional turquoise jewelry immediately identified him as Apache. Behind him came two more vehicles, carrying what Ruby referred to as the Council, a group of tribal elders and legal advocates who had been quietly building a case against the Blackwood family for decades. "Margaret, you old warrior," the first man said, embracing Ruby warmly. "I wondered when you'd finally come home to finish what Joe started." The man introduced himself to Nita as Thomas Stone Bear, a tribal lawyer who had been working with her grandfather since the 1970s to document land fraud throughout the Southwest. The others included Dr. Elena Martinez, a historian specializing in Spanish colonial documents, and James Red Cloud, whose own family had lost thousands of acres to the same fraudulent schemes. Inside the cabin, the group gathered around the kitchen table while Ruby explained about the hidden cellar and its contents. The revelation generated excitement that was almost palpable. "Joe always said he had evidence that would crack the whole conspiracy," Thomas said. "But he was so secretive about the details that sometimes we wondered if he was chasing shadows." Dr. Martinez was particularly interested in examining the Spanish documents. When Ruby led her into the cellar, her expertise immediately confirmed what they had suspected. The papers were genuine colonial-era land grants that had been stolen from Apache families and transferred to white settlers through forged documents. "These are extraordinary," she said, her voice filled with scholarly excitement and moral outrage. "The paper, the ink, the seals, everything authenticates as genuine 18th century Spanish colonial administration. But look at these signatures." She pointed to names at the bottom of several documents. These officials supposedly signed these transfers, but historical records show they were killed in Apache raids months before these dates. The forgeries are sophisticated, but not perfect. James Red Cloud studied copies of the documents with the focused attention of someone whose family's history was written in legal theft. "My great-grandfather's name is on 3 of these grants," he said quietly. "Land that's now worth millions, taken through papers signed by dead men." The implications were staggering. If the documents could be authenticated in court, they would prove that numerous prominent families throughout New Mexico and Arizona had built their wealth on systematically stolen Apache land. The financial liability for damages and restoration could reach hundreds of millions of dollars. But as the group continued their examination, Nita found herself drawn to one document that seemed different from the others. It was smaller, more elaborate, and decorated with symbols that reminded her of the designs on the Spanish coin Scout had discovered. Dr. Martinez noticed her interest and examined the document more closely. "This isn't a land grant," she said, her excitement growing. "It's something much more specific, a treasure map." The document appeared to be a detailed inventory of Spanish colonial wealth that had been hidden during the Apache Wars. According to Dr. Martinez's translation, it described silver and gold artifacts, religious items, and most importantly, additional legal documents that had been concealed in a location marked by specific landmarks. The Spanish administrators knew the territory was becoming too dangerous. she explained. They buried their most valuable possessions and official records, planning to retrieve them when the conflict ended. But many of those officials never survived to return. Thomas Stonebear leaned forward intently. Are you saying there's more evidence hidden somewhere else? Not just evidence, Dr. Martinez replied. According to this document, there's an entire archive of colonial administration. Records, original land surveys, mineral rights assignments, tax records, everything needed to prove exactly how much land was stolen and who was responsible. The treasure map showed landmarks that were described in Spanish colonial terms: a distinctive rock formation, a seasonal creek, a grove of ancient trees. The challenge was translating centuries-old descriptions into modern geographical references. Ruby studied the map with the practiced eye of someone who had spent her lifetime traveling throughout Apache country. I think I know this place, she said slowly. The descriptions match an area about 20 miles north of here, near the old Spanish trail that connected Santa Fe to the mining settlements. But their discussion was interrupted by Scout's low growl from his position near the window. The old dog had remained alert throughout their meeting, and his warning indicated that they were being watched. Through careful observation, they spotted two men with binoculars positioned on a distant ridge. The surveillance was professional and patient, suggesting that Blackwood's organization had resources beyond simple land speculation. They're mapping our movements, Thomas observed grimly. Learning who's involved, what resources we have. James. Red Cloud's expression hardened. My grandfather always said the thieves would kill to protect their secrets. Looks like some things never change. The realization that they were under active surveillance transformed their planning from academic excitement to urgent strategy. Whatever evidence existed at the location described in the treasure map, they would have to reach it before Blackwood's people discovered their intentions. Dr. Martinez photographed all the documents with professional equipment, creating backup records that could be stored in multiple secure locations. But the originals would need to remain hidden until they could be presented in court under controlled conditions. We need to move fast, Ruby said. Vincent Blackwood isn't just a land developer. He's the current patriarch of a family that's been covering up crimes for over a century. They have political connections, financial resources, and as we've seen, they're not afraid to use intimidation. Thomas pulled out a satellite phone and began making calls to allies throughout Indian country. Within an hour, he had arranged for additional security from tribal police and contacted federal authorities who specialized in prosecuting historical land fraud cases. But even as they made preparations, Nita found herself studying the antique Spanish crucifix that had been stored with the treasure map. The religious artifact was beautiful, decorated with intricate metalwork that caught the lamplight in interesting ways. Scout seemed particularly drawn to the crucifix, sniffing it carefully and whining softly. His behavior reminded Nita of the way he had acted before discovering the hidden cellar. There's something special about this piece, she said, holding the crucifix up to examine it more closely. Dr. Martinez took the artifact and studied it with professional attention. Colonial Spanish metalwork often included hidden compartments, she explained. Religious items were particularly common for concealing small but valuable objects. After several minutes of careful examination, she found a tiny mechanism hidden in the base of the crucifix. When pressed correctly, it revealed a narrow compartment containing a tightly rolled piece of parchment. The hidden document was small but incredibly detailed, a precise map showing the exact location of the main treasure cache. Unlike the general descriptions in the larger document, this map included specific measurements, compass directions, and landmarks that would allow accurate navigation to the burial site. This changes everything, Thomas said, studying the detailed. We're not just talking about legal evidence anymore. If this map is accurate, we're looking at Spanish colonial treasure that could be worth tens of millions of dollars. Ruby's expression grew troubled. Money like that makes people desperate. The Blackwood family has spent over a century building their wealth on stolen land. They won't hesitate to use violence to protect those secrets." As if summoned by her words, the sound of multiple vehicles approaching on the desert road drew everyone's attention. Through the windows, they could see a convoy of expensive SUVs raising dust clouds as they approached the cabin at high speed. Scout positioned himself protectively in front of Nita, his hackles raised and his teeth bared. The old dog's transformation, from gentle companion to fierce guardian, was immediate and complete. "Vincent Blackwood doesn't make social calls after dark," Ruby observed grimly. "He's coming to end this before we can expose his family's crimes." Thomas reached for his satellite phone to call for help, but the approaching vehicles were already too close. Whatever Vincent Blackwood planned to do, they would have to face it, with only the resources immediately available. Nita clutched the Spanish crucifix, feeling the weight of centuries-old secrets in her small hands. Her grandfather had spent his lifetime protecting these documents, and now that responsibility had fallen to her. But she was no longer alone. She had Ruby's wisdom, the support of the tribal council, and most importantly, Scout's unwavering loyalty. The first SUV stopped directly in front of the cabin, its headlights illuminating the building in harsh white light. Vincent Blackwood stepped out, followed by 6 men whose bearing suggested they were more than simple employees. "Mrs. Songbird," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to intimidating opponents. "I think it's time we had a more serious conversation about your granddaughter's future." Ruby stepped onto the porch with the dignified bearing of an Apache matriarch facing an ancient enemy. Behind her, Thomas Stone Bear and the other tribal advocates formed a protective semicircle, their presence transforming what Blackwood had, intended as an intimidation session, into something approaching a formal confrontation. "Mr. Blackwood," Ruby said calmly, "you're trespassing on private property. I suggest you state your business quickly and leave." Blackwood's smile was predatory. "My business is simple, Mrs. Songbird. Your granddaughter is in possession of certain historical artifacts that rightfully belong to my family's estate. I'm prepared to compensate her fairly for their return." "What artifacts?" Thomas Stone Bear stepped forward, his legal training evident in the precision of his question. "Documents and maps that were stolen from my great-grandfather's collection." "During the territorial period," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Family papers that have significant genealogical value but no real legal standing." Dr. Martinez emerged from the cabin carrying her camera equipment, her scholarly credentials evident in her professional demeanor. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm Dr. Elena Martinez from the University of New Mexico. I've been examining the documents in question, and I can assure you they are authentic Spanish colonial land grants, not family genealogical records." Blackwood's expression hardened slightly. "Dr. Martinez, I'm familiar with your work on behalf of various tribal causes. Your interpretation of these documents is colored by political bias rather than objective scholarship. The authenticity of Spanish colonial documents is determined by forensic analysis, not political perspective," she replied evenly. "These papers prove systematic fraud in the territorial land transfer process." One of Blackwood's men stepped closer to the porch, his hand resting conspicuously on something concealed beneath his jacket. Scout's low growl became more pronounced, and Nita could feel the tension escalating toward violence. But Ruby raised her hand in a gesture that somehow managed to calm both Scout and the approaching conflict. "Vincent," she said, using his first name with deliberate familiarity, "your great-grandfather, Judge William Blackwood, was corrupt, and your family has been living off stolen Apache land for over a century. We both know it, and now we have the evidence to prove it in federal court." Blackwood's careful composure cracked slightly. "You have nothing that will stand up in court. Old papers with questionable provenance, interpreted by activists with an agenda. We have Spanish colonial documents with intact seals, authenticated by forensic experts, proving that your family forged land transfers using the signatures of dead officials, Thomas replied. We also have witness statements from Apache elders whose grandparents saw the original thefts taking place. Most importantly, James Red Cloud added, stepping into the circle of light, we have the financial records showing how your family converted stolen land into mining and development profits over 5 generations. Blackwood studied James with particular attention. Mr. Red Cloud, I believe your family has received significant financial assistance from my company's foundation over the years. Educational scholarships, medical assistance, employment opportunities. It would be unfortunate if that relationship were to become adversarial. The implied threat was clear. Cooperation with Ruby's legal effort would result in economic retaliation against Apache families who depended on Blackwood's apparent generosity. Vincent, Ruby said quietly, threatening people only works when they have something left to lose. You've already taken everything from us that matters. Our land, our resources, our children's futures. What you can't take is our dignity and our determination to see justice done. Inside the cabin, Nita watched through the window as this confrontation unfolded. She had spent her short life learning to survive in isolation, but now she was witnessing something larger. The moment when her family's private struggle became part of a community's fight for historical justice. The Spanish crucifix felt warm in her hands, and she found herself thinking about her grandfather's stories of Apache warriors who had faced impossible odds with courage rooted in protection of their people. She was no longer just an orphaned girl trying to survive on worthless land. She was the keeper of evidence that could restore justice for countless families. Scout suddenly left his position by the porch and trotted to Nita's side, his behavior suggesting that he sensed her emotional transformation. The old dog's dark eyes seemed to hold approval for the courage he saw growing in her young heart. Outside, Blackwood was making one final attempt to resolve the situation through intimidation. Mrs. Songbird, you're an elderly woman living in isolation with a young child. Accidents happen in remote areas. People get lost in the desert. Vehicles break down miles from help. It would be tragic if your stubbornness led to unnecessary suffering. The threat was unmistakable, and its effect on the tribal advocates was immediate. Thomas reached for his satellite phone while Dr. Martinez began photographing Blackwood and his men, creating a record of their presence and implied threats. But Ruby's response surprised everyone, including Blackwood himself. She began to laugh, not with humor, but with the grim satisfaction of someone who had finally maneuvered an enemy into a trap. Vincent, you just made a serious mistake, she said. Thomas, please inform our friends in the FBI that Mr. Blackwood has just threatened federal witnesses in a civil rights investigation. Blackwood's expression showed the first genuine concern Nita had seen since his arrival. What civil rights investigation? The one that began 3 hours ago when we presented evidence of systematic land fraud targeting Native American families, Thomas replied, holding up his satellite phone. Federal agents are already en route to secure the scene and protect the witnesses. Dr. Martinez smiled grimly. Mr. Blackwood, threatening witnesses in a federal civil rights case is a felony that carries a minimum 10-year sentence. Your lawyers will explain the legal implications when you're arrested. The sound of helicopters approaching from the north confirmed Thomas's statement. Blackwood and his men looked toward the sky, where the lights of federal aircraft were becoming visible against the star-filled desert night. This isn't over, Blackwood said, but his voice had lost its previous authority. Yes, it is, Ruby replied firmly. Your family's century of theft and intimidation ends tonight. The evidence will be presented in federal court, the stolen land will be returned to its rightful owners, and your family will finally face consequences for crimes that should have been prosecuted decades ago. As Blackwood and his men retreated to their vehicles, Nita emerged from the cabin, carrying the tribal council peace pipe that Ruby had brought as a symbol of community support. The ceremonial object seemed to catch and reflect the approaching helicopter lights, creating a moment of almost spiritual significance. "Grandfather," she whispered, looking up at the star-filled sky, "we kept your promise. Justice is finally coming home." Scout barked once in agreement, his tail wagging with satisfaction as the federal helicopters landed in the desert beyond their small cabin, bringing with them the full weight of American law enforcement to protect the evidence that would restore Apache dignity after more than a century of systematic theft. The federal agents who emerged from the helicopters were led by Special Agent Sarah Chen, a woman whose calm efficiency immediately commanded respect from everyone present. Her team included specialists in financial crimes, historical document authentication, and Native American civil rights violations. But as Agent Chen interviewed the witnesses and examined the evidence, Scout began displaying behavior that was both familiar and puzzling. The old dog kept returning to the cabin, circling the interior with obvious agitation, then approaching Nita with something that looked almost like urgency. "He's been acting strange all evening," Nita told Ruby, "like he's trying to tell me something important." Ruby studied Scout's behavior with the attention of someone who had learned to read animal instincts. "Your grandfather always said Scout was trained for specific purposes. Maybe there's something else he's trying to show you." Inside the cabin, while the adults continued their discussions with federal agents, Nita knelt beside Scout and ran her hands along his collar. The leather was worn smooth by years of wear, but as her fingers traced its surface, she felt something unusual, a small, hard shape sewn into the collar's lining. Using her grandfather's carving knife, she carefully opened a section of the stitching. Hidden inside was a tightly wrapped piece of oiled cloth containing a letter written in her grandfather's familiar handwriting. The letter was addressed to her specifically, with instructions to open it only if strangers came asking dangerous questions about our family's business. As she unfolded the pages, Scout sat beside her with an expression of obvious relief, as if a long-held responsibility was finally being fulfilled. The letter's contents made her blood run cold. "My dear Nita, if you are reading this, it means the Blackwood family has finally discovered the location of the evidence I have been protecting. What you have found in the cellar is important, but it is only the beginning of a much larger truth. Vincent Blackwood is not just a land developer trying to cover up his family's historical crimes. He is the current leader of an organization that has been systematically stealing Native American resources for over a century. The Blackwood family has used their wealth and political connections to maintain a network of corruption that extends from local judges to federal bureaucrats. The Spanish documents you have discovered prove that his great-grandfather, Judge William Blackwood, was not just corrupt. He was the architect of the most extensive land fraud scheme in American history. Using his position as territorial judge, he created a system for transferring Native American land to white settlers through forged documents, bribed officials, and fabricated legal proceedings. But Vincent's crimes are not historical. He has continued his family's criminal enterprise, using modern financial instruments and political influence to steal mineral rights, water resources, and development opportunities from tribal communities. Throughout the Southwest, the evidence of his current activities is hidden in a location that only Scout knows how to find. The dog has been trained since he was a puppy to lead you to this evidence if anything ever happened to me. Scout knows the location of documents and recordings that will destroy not just the Blackwood family, but an entire network of politicians, judges, and business leaders who have been profiting from the systematic theft of Native American resources. But be warned, my granddaughter, this evidence is more dangerous than anything you have seen so far. Vincent Blackwood and his allies have killed. To protect these secrets, and they will kill again. Trust no one except family and the old ways that have protected our people for generations." The letter continued with specific instructions for following Scout to the hidden evidence, but it also contained a warning that chilled Nita to her bones. Vincent Blackwood knows about this letter. He has been waiting for 30 years for me to die so he could search for it. He will do anything to prevent you from finding what Scout is trained to protect. As she finished reading, Nita became aware that the conversations outside had stopped. Through the window, she could see that Agent Chen and her team were gathered around Ruby and Thomas, but their body language suggested tension rather than cooperation. Scout's low growl drew her attention to movement near the back of the cabin. Through the kitchen window, she could see figures moving in the darkness, people who were not part of the federal team. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Vincent Blackwood had not retreated. He had simply moved his operation to the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. But the letter contained one more revelation that transformed her understanding of everything that had happened. The federal agents who respond to your call for help may not all be trustworthy. Vincent Blackwood has allies throughout the government who will try to discredit or destroy the evidence. Trust Scout's instincts about people. He has been trained to recognize friend from enemy, as if responding to his name in the letter. Scout moved to the front window and began barking with unusual intensity. Outside, Agent Chen was approaching the cabin with several of her team members, but something in their movement pattern seemed wrong to Nita's increasingly alert senses. Ruby appeared at the cabin door, her expression troubled. "Nita, these agents want to take the documents into federal custody immediately. They say it's for our protection, but Thomas thinks we should wait for additional legal representation." Through the window, Nita could see that Dr. Martinez and James Red Cloud were no longer visible among the group outside. The federal agents who remained seemed to be positioning themselves in ways that suggested containment rather than protection. Scout's behavior became increasingly agitated. The old dog moved from window to window, his warning barks indicating threats from multiple directions. His training was clear. The cabin was surrounded by people who meant them harm. "Ruby," Nita whispered, "urgently. We need to get to the cellar right now." But as they moved toward the loose floorboards, Agent Chen entered the cabin without invitation. Her professional demeanor had been replaced by something harder and more calculating. "Mrs. Songbird, I'm going to need you and the child to come with us for protective custody," she said. "We have intelligence suggesting that Blackwood's people are planning an immediate assault on this location." Ruby's response was immediate and definitive. "We're not going anywhere until our lawyer arrives." "I'm afraid that's not an option, Agent," Chen replied. Nita noticed that her hand was resting on her weapon. "This is now a matter of national security." Scout's barking reached a fever pitch, and suddenly Nita understood what her grandfather had been trying to tell her. The federal agents were not here to protect them. They were here to eliminate the evidence and anyone who had seen it. Vincent Blackwood had not just built his fortune on stolen land. He had also purchased protection from within the federal government itself. The corruption extended far beyond historical land fraud into active conspiracy involving current law enforcement officials. As this realization crystallized, Scout positioned himself between Nita and Agent Chen, his hackles raised and his teeth bared. The old dog's message was unmistakable. These people were enemies, and the real fight for survival was just beginning. "Ruby," Nita said quietly, "Scout wants us to follow him. Right now." Agent Chen's hand moved toward her weapon, but Scout was already in motion, leading them toward the back of the cabin, where a century-old escape route waited to protect them from enemies their grandfather had spent his lifetime preparing to face. Scout led them through a concealed door in the cabin's back wall that Nita had never noticed before, a narrow opening hidden behind a bookshelf that her grandfather had designed as an emergency exit. The passage led into a natural cave system. that extended deep into the rocky ridge behind their property. Ruby moved with surprising agility for her age, following Scout's confident navigation through passages that seemed to be carved by both water and deliberate human modification. Behind them, they could hear Agent Chen's team searching the cabin, their voices growing increasingly frustrated as they realized their quarry had vanished. "Your grandfather was always planning for this day," Ruby whispered as they moved deeper into the cave system. "He spent 30 years preparing escape routes and hiding places throughout this entire area." The caves were not random natural formations. They had been modified over generations by Apache families who had used them as shelters during the worst periods of territorial violence. Her grandfather had simply continued that tradition, creating a network of safe passages that could hide and protect anyone who knew their secrets. Scout seemed to know exactly where he was going, leading them through twists and turns that would have been impossible to navigate without his guidance. His training went far beyond simple guard dog behavior. He had been prepared for exactly this situation. After 20 minutes of careful movement through increasingly complex passages, they emerged into a large natural chamber illuminated by battery-powered lights that her grandfather had installed years earlier. The space contained supplies for extended hiding, food, water, medical equipment, and communication devices, but most importantly, it contained Thomas Stonebear, Dr. Martinez, and James Red Cloud, who had reached the cave system through a different entrance when they realized that Agent Chen's team was not what they claimed to be. "We barely got out before they sealed the perimeter," Thomas reported grimly. "Those aren't real federal agents. They're private military contractors working for Blackwood." Dr. Martinez was examining documents by battery-powered lantern light. "I managed to photograph everything before we escaped, but the originals are still hidden in the cabin's cellar. If they find those documents and destroy them, we'll only have copies that may not stand up in court." James Red Cloud was monitoring radio communications on equipment that looked both military and highly sophisticated. "Real FBI agents are en route from Albuquerque, but they're still 40 minutes away. Blackwood's people know they have a narrow window to eliminate the evidence and anyone who's seen it." Ruby studied the cave system with the attention of someone making tactical decisions. Joe spent decades preparing for this exact situation. He knew that when the truth finally came out, powerful people would try to kill it before it could reach a courtroom. She led them deeper into the cave system, where additional chambers contained equipment that looked more like a military command post than a simple hiding place. Maps of the entire region, communication equipment, weapons, and supplies that could sustain a small group for weeks. "Your grandfather wasn't just a code talker," Ruby explained to Nita's growing amazement. "After the war, he was recruited by military intelligence to help monitor Soviet activity in the Southwest. He used that training and those connections to document the Blackwood family's criminal network. In one carefully protected container, they found recordings, dozens of hours of conversations that her grandfather had secretly captured over the years. Vincent Blackwood discussing bribery of federal officials, judges coordinating decisions to favor Blackwood's land acquisitions, politicians planning to suppress Native American legal challenges. "This is enough evidence to bring down half the territorial government," Thomas said, his voice filled with awe and determination. But Scout's agitated behavior indicated that their hiding place would not remain secret for long. The old dog was moving between different cave entrances, his warning barks suggesting that Blackwood's people were systematically searching the entire area. "We need to get this evidence to the real federal agents," Dr. Martinez said. "But first, we have to survive long enough to make contact." James Red Cloud's radio monitoring revealed the scope of Blackwood's operation. Private military contractors were sweeping the entire region, using night vision equipment and trained search dogs to track their movements through the cave system. "There's something else," Ruby said quietly. "Scout hasn't led us to the final encache yet, the location described in your grandfather's letter." The most damaging evidence is still hidden somewhere else. Nita studied Scout's behavior carefully. The old dog was indeed still agitated, still trying to communicate something that went beyond simple warning about immediate danger. He wants us to follow him somewhere specific, she realized. Even now, with all this danger, he's still trying to complete his mission. Ruby nodded grimly. Your grandfather always said that Scout would know when the time was right to reveal the final secrets. Apparently that time is now. The letter had mentioned that Scout was trained to lead her to evidence that would destroy not just the Blackwood family, but an entire network of politicians, judges, and business leaders. What they had found so far was significant, but it was apparently not the complete truth. Where does he want to go? Thomas asked. Scout had positioned himself near a cave entrance that led toward the north, in the direction of the location described. In the Spanish treasure map, the coincidence seemed too significant to ignore. The Spanish colonial treasure site, Dr. Martinez said, studying the map they had discovered in the crucifix. Your grandfather didn't just hide modern evidence there. He combined it with the historical proof of the original land theft. James Red Cloud's radio intercepts were becoming more urgent. Blackwood's teams were closing in on the cave system, using equipment that suggested they were familiar with the terrain and the hiding places. We have 15 minutes, maybe 20, before they find these caves, he reported. Ruby made the decision with the authority of someone who had been preparing for this moment for 30 years. We follow Scout. Whatever your grandfather hid in that location, it's worth risking everything to protect. The journey through the remaining cave passages required technical climbing skills that Scout somehow possessed, despite his age. The old dog navigated rope bridges and narrow ledges with the confidence of an animal that had been trained for exactly this terrain. They emerged from the cave system at a location that matched the Spanish colonial map perfectly. A distinctive rock formation near an ancient grove of cottonwood trees. But the site had been modified in ways that were not shown on any historical document. Hidden beneath carefully camouflaged covering, they found an underground vault that combined Spanish colonial construction techniques with modern security measures. The entrance was protected by locks that required both the antique key from her grandfather's pouch and biometric recognition from Scout himself. Inside the vault, they discovered the full scope of her grandfather's 30-year investigation. Not just documents and recordings, but financial records, photographs, and evidence of crimes that extended far beyond land fraud into drug trafficking, money laundering, and political assassination. Vincent Blackwood's family has been running a criminal empire for over a century, Thomas said, his voice filled with amazement and horror. They've used their wealth and political connections to commit every kind of crime imaginable. But the most shocking revelation was a collection of recent documents proving that the fake federal agents were part of a much larger conspiracy. Vincent Blackwood had purchased protection from within multiple government agencies, creating a network of corruption that reached from local sheriffs to federal prosecutors. This is why he was so confident, Ruby realized. He owns pieces of the justice system itself. The sound of helicopters approaching interrupted their examination of the evidence. But James Red Cloud's radio monitoring indicated that these were the real federal agents, FBI specialists in corruption cases who had been secretly investigating the Blackwood network for months. Agent Chen and her team were trying to steal the evidence before the real investigation could use it, Dr. Martinez realized. Scout barked once in satisfaction, his mission finally complete. The old dog had successfully led them to evidence that would not only restore Apache land rights, but would also destroy a criminal network that had operated with impunity for over a century. As the legitimate federal helicopters landed near the ancient Cottonwood Grove, Nita clutched the Apache war shield that Ruby had brought from tribal headquarters. The ceremonial object represented not just protection, but the courage needed to face enemies who had seemed invincible for too long. "Grandfather," she whispered, "we found everything you hid Justice is finally coming for the people who stole from us, but Scout's sudden alertness indicated that the final confrontation was not over. Vincent Blackwood himself was approaching through the desert darkness, leading one last, desperate attempt to destroy the evidence that would end his family's century of crime. Vincent Blackwood appeared at the edge of the cottonwood grove like a spectre from the desert darkness, flanked by 6 heavily armed men whose professional movements indicated military training. But his desperation was evident in the wild look, in his eyes, and the way his hands shook as he called out to the group gathered around the hidden vault. "Mrs. Songbird," he shouted, his voice carrying across the desert air. "You have something that belongs to my family. I'm prepared to negotiate a reasonable settlement." Ruby stepped forward, holding her grandfather's ceremonial knife with the calm dignity of someone who had finally chosen to stand and fight. "Vincent, your family has stolen enough from us. The only settlement we're interested in is justice." The real FBI agents who had arrived in the helicopters were already moving to secure the perimeter, but Blackwood's men were well positioned and heavily armed. The situation was rapidly escalating toward violence that could destroy both the evidence and the people trying to protect it. Scout positioned himself directly in front of Nita, his hackles raised and his body tensed for action. The old dog's transformation from gentle companion to fierce protector was complete. He was ready to give his life to fulfill the mission her grandfather had trained him for. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," Blackwood continued, his voice growing more desperate. "That evidence implicates people throughout the federal government. If it reaches a courtroom, it won't just destroy my family. It will bring down judges, senators, cabinet members." Thomas Stone Bear stepped beside Ruby, his legal training evident in his measured response. "That's exactly why it needs to reach a courtroom, Vincent. Your family's corruption has infected our entire system of justice." Dr. Martinez was still photographing documents by flashlight, creating backup records even as the confrontation intensified around her. "These financial records show bribes to federal judges totaling over $20 million, she called out. "This isn't just land fraud, it's systematic corruption of the federal judiciary." Blackwood's response was immediate and violent. He signaled to his men, who began advancing through the grove with weapons raised. But Scout was already in motion, his powerful legs carrying him toward the lead gunman with the speed and determination of a missile. The old dog's attack caught Blackwood's men off guard. Scout's jaws clamped onto the lead gunman's weapon arm, with crushing force, sending the rifle spinning into the darkness. But the impact of tackling a man twice his weight sent Scout tumbling hard against the base of a cottonwood tree. Nita screamed as she saw Scout struggle to stand, his left front leg clearly injured, but his determination undiminished. The old dog limped back toward her, positioning himself once again between her and the approaching gunman. "Scout!" she cried, dropping to her knees beside her wounded companion. The FBI agents were engaging Blackwood's men with professional precision, but the firefight was taking place dangerously close to the vault containing irreplaceable historical evidence. Ruby grabbed Nita's arm, pulling her toward cover behind the ancient cottonwoods. "The knife," Ruby said urgently, pressing her grandfather's ceremonial weapon into Nita's hands. "If something happens to me, use this to cut the straps on that. Leather case. The documents inside are the most important evidence we have." Blackwood himself was advancing through the chaos, a pistol in his hand and madness in his eyes. 60 years I've been preparing for this day," he shouted over the gunfire. 60 years of planning to destroy every piece of evidence my great-grandfather left behind." Thomas Stone Bear tackled him before he could reach the vault. Both men rolling through the desert sand in a desperate struggle for the weapon. But Blackwood was younger and more desperate and gradually gained the upper hand in their fight. James Red Cloud was coordinating with the FBI agents through his radio equipment, directing them toward Blackwood's remaining men. "We have 3 hostiles down, but Blackwood himself is still active," he reported. Dr. Martinez had managed to secure the most critical documents in waterproof containers, but she was trapped behind inadequate cover as bullets shredded the bark of the cottonwood trees around her. Nita watched the battle unfold with growing understanding that the outcome would determine not just her own fate, but the future of every Apache family that had been victimized by the Blackwood criminal network. The ceremonial knife felt warm and powerful in her hands, connecting her to generations of Apache warriors who had fought impossible odds to protect their people. Scout's injured whimpering cut through the chaos of gunfire, and suddenly Nita realized what she had to do. Her grandfather had spent 30 years preparing for this moment, training Scout to protect the evidence that would bring justice to their people. Now it was her turn to honor that legacy with courage that matched her heritage. Nita rose from beside Scout with the ceremonial knife clutched in her small hands, her movements guided by instincts that seemed to flow from generations of Apache warriors who had faced impossible odds with unwavering courage. The firefight continued around her, but her focus was entirely on the leather case containing the most damaging evidence against the Blackwood criminal empire. Blackwood had managed to break free from Thomas Stonebear's grip and was advancing toward the vault. With desperate determination, his pistol was raised, aimed not at the FBI agents, but at the precious documents that could destroy his family's century of corruption. "No!" Nita shouted, throwing herself between Blackwood and the evidence. The sight of an 8-year-old girl defending historical documents with nothing but a ceremonial knife seemed to freeze everyone in the grove for a crucial moment. Even the gunfire paused as both sides processed the incredible courage of a child willing to face an armed adult to protect her people's heritage. Blackwood's expression showed a moment of uncertainty. "Child, move away from there. This doesn't concern you. It concerns me more than anyone," Nita replied, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. "You stole from my family for over a century. You killed my people and took our land. But you can't steal our courage." Scout, despite his injury, managed to stand and limp to Nita's side. The old dog's loyalty transcended his physical pain, and his presence seemed to give her additional strength. Ruby's voice carried across the grove with the authority of an Apache matriarch. "Vincent Blackwood, you are facing a child who carries the spirit of every warrior who died protecting our people from thieves like your family. Look into her eyes and see your judgment." The federal agents used the momentary pause to advance their positions, but their priority was clearly protecting Nita rather than simply capturing Blackwood. The sight of a small girl defending priceless historical evidence had transformed their tactical approach into something approaching a rescue mission. Dr. Martinez seized the opportunity to secure additional documents, stuffing them into protective containers with efficient movements that spoke of scholarly dedication combined with physical courage. "These financial records alone will convict dozens of corrupt officials," she called out. But Blackwood's desperation was driving him toward a final, violent solution. "If I can't have those documents, then no one can," he shouted, raising his weapon toward the vault itself. Thomas Stonebear, blood streaming from cuts sustained in their fight, launched himself at Blackwood one more time. But the older man was ready for the attack, sidestepping at the last moment and bringing his pistol to bear on Thomas's exposed back. The shot never came. James Red Cloud, using skills developed during his own military service, had flanked Blackwood's position and tackled him from behind just as his finger tightened on the trigger. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs and weapons, rolling dangerously close to the vault entrance. The federal agents moved with practiced efficiency to secure the remaining hostile forces, but the central confrontation was now between James and Vincent Blackwood, two men fighting for control of evidence that could reshape the legal landscape of the entire Southwest. Nita found herself holding the ceremonial knife over the leather case, ready to defend it with her life if necessary. But Scout's suddenly relaxed posture told her that the immediate danger was passing. The sound of additional helicopters approaching indicated that federal reinforcements were arriving. The FBI had called in a full task force to secure what was clearly the most significant cache of evidence ever discovered in a corruption investigation. Blackwood's final attempt to destroy the evidence ended when James Red Cloud managed to pin him long enough for federal agents to apply restraints. But his capture revealed the true scope of his desperation. Concealed on his body were additional weapons and what appeared to be small explosive devices. He was planning to destroy the entire site, one of the FBI agents observed grimly. Evidence, witnesses, everything. Ruby approached Nita with tears in her eyes, gently taking the ceremonial knife and replacing it with an official document that had just been delivered by one of the federal agents. "What is it?" Nita asked. "A federal land rights certificate." Ruby replied, her voice filled with emotion. "The government's official recognition that this land and thousands of acres throughout the region rightfully belongs to Apache families. The evidence you and Scout protected just restored our people's heritage." As federal agents led Vincent Blackwood away in restraints, he made one final attempt to intimidate the witnesses. "This won't end with me," he called out. "My family has allies you'll never identify." Thomas Stonebear, despite his injuries, managed to stand and address Blackwood directly. "Vincent, your family's century of crime ends tonight. The evidence we've preserved will expose every corrupt official, every bribed judge, every stolen acre. Your allies will abandon you to save themselves." The arrival of tribal council members and additional legal advocates confirmed that the night's events had already become a watershed moment in Native American civil rights. The evidence would not only restore land rights, but would also lead to prosecutions that would reshape the entire political landscape of the Southwest. As Scout settled beside her, his injury being treated by a federal medic, Nita realized that her grandfather's 30-year mission was finally complete. Justice had arrived for the Apache people, carried by the courage of an old dog and a young girl who refused to let their family's legacy be destroyed by fear. 6 months after the confrontation at the Cottonwood Grove, Nita stood beside Scout on the front porch of their restored cabin, watching the sunrise paint the New Mexico desert in shades of gold and amber. The old dog's leg had healed completely, though he still carried himself with the dignified bearing of a warrior who had served his people with honor. The cabin itself had been transformed from a simple survival shelter into a warm family home where Nita and Ruby lived together, sharing the daily rhythms of desert life while building toward a future that honored their Apache heritage. Ruby's presence had filled the space with laughter, traditional stories, and the gentle guidance that Nita had never known she was missing. But the most remarkable transformation was visible in the distance, where construction crews were putting finishing touches on the Apache Cultural Center and Heritage Foundation. The new building, funded by the financial settlement from the Blackwood lawsuit, would serve as both a museum preserving Apache history and a legal center helping other Native American families reclaim their stolen heritage. "Your grandfather would be so proud," Ruby said, joining Nita on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. "Not just of the justice we achieved, but of the courage you showed when it mattered most." The legal aftermath of their discovery had exceeded everyone's expectations. Vincent Blackwood was serving a federal sentence that would keep him imprisoned for the rest of his life. More importantly, the evidence had led to prosecutions of corrupt judges, politicians, and business leaders throughout the Southwest. The network of corruption that had operated with impunity for over a century had been completely dismantled. Thomas Stonebear now served as the Foundation's chief legal counsel, coordinating with federal authorities to help other Native American communities reclaim their ancestral lands. His offices in the cultural center were already handling dozens of cases involving stolen water rights, mineral claims, and development projects built on fraudulent land transfers. Dr. Martinez had been appointed as the Foundation's chief historian, leading efforts to authenticate and preserve Spanish colonial documents that had been hidden or stolen throughout the region. Her work was revealing the true scope of the historical land theft, providing legal evidence that was restoring millions of acres to tribal control. James Redcloud had established a security consulting firm specializing in protecting Native American communities from the kind of intimidation and violence that the Blackwood family had used for generations. His first clients were Apache families who were reclaiming valuable property and needed protection from desperate former occupants. But perhaps the most significant change was visible in Scout himself. The old dog had become something of a celebrity in tribal communities throughout the Southwest, recognized as a hero whose courage and loyalty had helped expose one of the largest corruption schemes in American history. Children would visit the cultural center specifically to meet the dog, who had helped save their people's heritage. "He knows he's famous," Nita observed, watching Scout greet a group of school children with the patient dignity of a grandfather sharing wisdom with the next generation. The foundation stone ceremony had been particularly meaningful, with Apache elders from throughout the region gathering to bless the new cultural center and acknowledge the courage that had made its construction possible. The foundation stone itself contained artifacts from the Spanish colonial cache, ensuring that the historical evidence would be permanently preserved and protected. Nita had spoken at the ceremony, her words carrying the wisdom that comes from facing impossible odds and discovering inner strength that transcends age or size. "My grandfather always said that the most valuable things are hidden in plain sight," she had told the gathering. "The courage to fight for justice was inside our community all along. We just needed to remember how to find it." The financial settlement from the Blackwood lawsuit had provided resources that were transforming Apache communities throughout the region. New schools, medical facilities, economic development projects, and educational scholarships were creating opportunities that had been stolen from previous generations. But beyond the material benefits, the psychological impact was even more profound. Apache families who had lived with poverty and marginalization for generations now understood that their suffering had been the result of systematic theft rather than personal inadequacy. That knowledge was empowering an entire generation of young Native Americans to pursue education, careers, and leadership roles with confidence in their cultural identity and legal rights. Ruby had become a grandmother figure not just to Nita, but to dozens of Apache children whose families had been affected by the Blackwood corruption. The Cultural Center hosted weekend programs where she taught traditional crafts, shared historical stories, and helped young people understand their connection to ancestral traditions. "The healing has just begun," she often told visitors. "For over a century, our people carried the pain of thinking we had somehow lost our land through our own weakness. Now we know the truth. We were victims of sophisticated criminals who used the law itself as a weapon against us." On this particular morning, as they watched the sun climb above the desert horizon, Scout suddenly became alert and trotted toward the dirt road that led to their property. In the distance, a familiar pickup truck was raising a dust cloud as it approached their home. Thomas Stonebear climbed out of the vehicle, carrying a folder of documents that he handled with obvious excitement. "We have news," he announced. "Big news." The documents contained federal court decisions that had been reached during the night. Based on the evidence from the Blackwood case, judges throughout the Southwest were ruling in favor of Apache land. Claims that had been tied up in legal challenges for decades. 12,000 acres, Thomas announced with satisfaction, restored to tribal ownership as of this morning. But that's not the best part. He pulled out additional documents showing that similar cases were being resolved in favor of Native American communities throughout the region. The legal precedent established by the Blackwood prosecution was creating a wave of justice that would eventually restore hundreds of thousands of acres to their rightful owners. Scout barked once in satisfaction, as if he understood that the mission he had been trained to fulfill was continuing to bear fruit long after the initial confrontation. Standing on the porch of her grandfather's cabin, surrounded by the desert landscape that had seemed worthless to everyone except those who truly understood its value, Nita felt the deep contentment that comes from honoring family legacy while building a better future for generations yet to come. The wooden eagle feather still sat on her windowsill, catching the morning light and reminding her daily of the patience and courage required to carve something beautiful from simple materials. Like her grandfather's carving, the fight for justice had required vision, persistence, and faith that the truth would eventually emerge from years of careful, dedicated work. "Grandfather," she whispered, looking up at the vast sky where desert hawks rode the morning thermals, "we kept our promise. Our people are finally coming home."